Matthew Evans, a wealthy man in his late 70s, sat in his sleek silver Mercedes, tapping his fingers rhythmically on the steering wheel as the Kentucky sun bore down relentlessly. The car's air conditioning hummed softly, barely managing to keep the heat at bay. For a man whose life had been defined by success in business and finance, moments of inconvenience were rare. Yet, here he was, stranded on a quiet country road with a flat tire and no roadside assistance in sight. His phone stubbornly refused to find a signal, leaving him with nothing to do but wait. Frustration simmered beneath his composed demeanor. Waiting was not something he was used to as Matthew stared down the long, empty stretch of road. A figure appeared in the distance. A young boy, no older than 14, was walking toward him, wearing a faded t-shirt and sneakers so worn they barely held together. His strides were confident, his demeanor unflinching. As the boy approached, his eyes quickly scanned the situation, landing on the deflated tire. "Got a flat, sir?" he asked, his voice steady and polite. Matthew nodded, a mix of relief and unease washing over him. "Yes, I do. I was hoping to get some help, but my phone's no use out here." The boy smiled, a warm and confident expression that belied his years. "No problem. I can handle it. My grandpa taught me how to change a tire last summer." Without waiting for a reply, he knelt down by the car, gesturing toward the trunk. "You got a spare?" Matthew hesitated, but eventually pointed to the trunk, watching as the boy retrieved the tools and got to work. The boy's hands moved swiftly, his confidence unmistakable. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement. He approached the task with the kind of focus that comes from a place of experience and quiet pride. As Matthew stood watching, a peculiar sensation crept over him, humility. It wasn't a feeling he experienced often, but there it was, undeniable and unexpected. The boy finished quickly, wiping his hands on his already worn jeans. He stepped back and said, "All done." His face lighting up with a satisfied grin. Matthew reached into his wallet, pulling out several crisp bills and offering them to the boy. "Here, take this. I really appreciate your help," he said. But the boy simply shook his head, raising a hand in polite refusal. "Thank you, sir, but I don't need anything. Just happy to help." For a moment, Matthew was speechless. He watched as the boy walked away down the dusty road, his demeanor unchanged, his steps purposeful. Something about the interaction left Matthew deeply unsettled, not in a bad way, but in a way that stirred something long dormant within him. Alone once again, he climbed back into his car, his gaze lingering on the boy's retreating figure in the rearview mirror. The rest of the drive passed in a blur, his mind replaying the encounter over and over. There was something extraordinary about the boy, a quiet dignity and self-assurance that seemed entirely unconnected to material wealth or privilege that night. Back in his expansive home filled with fine art and untouched books, Matthew couldn't shake the image of the boy. It wasn't just his generosity, it was his character. This wasn't a young man seeking validation or reward. He was simply kind. And that kindness carried a weight Matthew hadn't felt in years. The next morning, Matthew found himself unable to shake the memory of the boy. He had met thousands of people throughout his life, business partners, employees, investors, yet none had left such a lasting impression. There was something about the way Elijah carried himself that stayed with him, a quiet confidence that seemed rooted in something far deeper than circumstance. Matthew was a man who prided himself on logic and pragmatism, yet here he was, compelled by something he couldn't quite explain, determined to understand the boy's story. Matthew decided to find him. He drove along the same stretch of road, his eyes scanning every curve and intersection for a sign of the young man. The morning sun climbed higher as hours passed, and frustration began to creep in. Stopping at a small diner, he approached the waitress, describing Elijah in detail. The woman gave him a curious look before pointing him toward an older woman wiping tables nearby. "That sounds like Elijah," the older woman said, a warm smile softening her weathered face. "He's a good kid, always helping folks. Lives with his mama in Harlan, over by the foothills." "Harlan," Matthew repeated, the name unfamiliar. After thanking her, he climbed back into his car and entered the address into his GPS. The drive was quiet, the scenery shifting from urban streets to rolling countryside. Trees lined the winding road, their leaves shimmering under the golden sunlight. But Matthew hardly noticed. His mind was busy piecing together questions he didn't yet have answers for. Who was this boy? What kind of life had shaped him? By the time Matthew reached the small town of Harlan, it felt like stepping into another world. Modest homes with well-worn porches lined the streets, and neighbors waved to one another as they passed. It was a far cry from the gated mansions and polished high-rises Matthew had grown accustomed to. He parked near a corner store and asked a few locals if they knew Elijah. Each response came with a smile, confirming what he already suspected. This boy had a reputation for kindness. Finally, a man at a gas station pointed him toward a house on the edge of town. Matthew approached the house cautiously. The faded paint and sagging porch told a story of resilience, not neglect. He hesitated at the door, unsure of what he'd say when it opened. Finally, he knocked, and after a moment, a woman answered. She appeared to be in her early 40s, her tired eyes filled with curiosity as she took him in. "Good morning," Matthew said, clearing his throat. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I believe I met your son yesterday, Elijah. He helped me with a flat tire." Her expression softened immediately, and she offered a small smile. "That sounds like my Elijah. He's always helping folks." She stepped aside, inviting him in, and led him through the modest home to the backyard. There, Matthew spotted Elijah repairing a fence, his hands steady as he worked. When the boy looked up, surprise flickered across his face. "Hey, mister," Elijah greeted, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What brings you here?" Matthew smiled, feeling an unfamiliar nervousness. "I just wanted to thank you again. You helped me when I needed it, and it stuck with me." Elijah shrugged, his expression unbothered. "It wasn't a big deal," he said simply, but to Matthew, it had been everything. Matthew stood by the fence, watching Elijah work with a quiet precision that belied his young age. The boy's movements were fluid, each step purposeful, as though he had done this 100 times before. Elijah straightened and turned toward Matthew, brushing the dirt off his hands. "Fence needed a little fixing," he said casually, his tone making it sound like the simplest thing in the world. Matthew took a moment to gather his thoughts. "You know, I don't think you realize how unusual what you did yesterday was," he began, his voice steady but thoughtful. "Most people wouldn't stop to help a stranger, let alone refuse a reward." Elijah shrugged, his gaze drifting to the trees at the edge of the yard. "It just seemed like the right thing to do. My grandpa always said, if you can help someone, you should. Doesn't cost anything to be kind." The simplicity of his words struck Matthew. In his world, every action seemed to have a price, an underlying transaction. This boy's kindness, given freely and without expectation, felt like an anomaly. Matthew glanced toward the house, where Elijah's mother stood at the back door, watching them with a soft smile. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," Matthew said, nodding toward the house. "Your mom must be proud." Elijah smiled, a genuine expression that lit up his face. "She works hard. I just try to make things easier where I can. Fixing things, running errands, it's the least I can do." As Elijah spoke, Matthew's gaze wandered over the yard. The fence, patched together with mismatched wood, told a story of resilience. The swing set, rusted and tilted, hinted at a childhood filled with making do. Yet, there was no sense of lack in Elijah's demeanor, only an unshakable contentment. It reminded Matthew of his own childhood, growing up in a modest home where his parents worked tirelessly to make ends meet. Somewhere along the way, he had lost touch with that version of himself, trading simplicity for luxury, connection for status. "I'd like to do something for you and your family," Matthew said after a pause, his tone sincere. "It's not about repaying a debt. It's about doing what feels right." Elijah tilted his head, his brow furrowing slightly. "We're okay, mister. Really, we don't need anything." Before Matthew could respond, Elijah's mother called from the porch, her voice warm but firm. "Elijah, it's time for lunch. Wash up, honey." Elijah turned back to Matthew with a grin. "She doesn't like it when I'm late." As the three of them walked toward the house, Elijah's mother turned to Matthew. "Would you like to join us? It's nothing fancy, but you're more than welcome." Matthew hesitated, unaccustomed to such unassuming generosity, but something in her tone left no room for refusal. "I'd like that," he said, following them inside. The scent of freshly baked bread filled the small kitchen as Matthew stepped inside, his tailored suit feeling oddly out of place amidst the humble surroundings. The table was set with care, though the mismatched chairs and modest dishes spoke of a family that prioritized love over luxury. Elijah washed his hands at the sink, humming softly to himself, while his mother busied herself, placing a steaming casserole dish in the center of the table. "Please, have a seat," she said warmly, motioning to a chair. Matthew hesitated for a moment, unused to such casual hospitality, but her kind smile left no room for refusal. He took his place, and soon Elijah joined, his grin wide and infectious. As they began to eat, the conversation flowed naturally, filled with stories of Elijah's school adventures and his dreams of becoming an engineer. His mother spoke with quiet pride about the close-knit community they lived in, where neighbors looked out for one another and shared what they could. Matthew found himself captivated by their genuine connection and the unassuming joy that seemed to permeate every word they spoke. "This is wonderful," Matthew said, gesturing to the food. "It's been a long time since I've had a meal that felt real." Elijah's mother laughed softly, her eyes sparkling. "We make do with what we have, but we always try to make it special." Matthew nodded, a pang of nostalgia washing over him. It reminded him of his childhood dinners, where his mother would stretch a meal to feed the family and still make it feel like a feast. He had spent so many years chasing wealth and status that he had forgotten the warmth of such simple moments. As the meal went on, Elijah's laughter echoed through the room, a sound so pure it seemed to brighten the very walls. Matthew couldn't help but smile, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. For all his wealth and success, his sprawling estate felt cold and empty compared to this small, vibrant home. When the plates were cleared, Matthew turned to Elijah's mother, his tone thoughtful. "You've done an incredible job raising him. He's got more heart and integrity than most people I've met." Her smile softened, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you. It hasn't always been easy, but we've learned to appreciate the little things." Matthew felt a stirring in his chest, an ache he couldn't quite explain. This family had given him something he didn't realize he was missing, a reminder of what truly mattered. As he left their home that afternoon, he couldn't shake the feeling that his encounter with Elijah was more than chance. Driving back to his estate, a plan began to form in his mind. He wasn't sure how yet, but he knew he couldn't just walk away. He had to do something. The drive back to his estate felt unusually quiet. Matthew Evans, a man accustomed to the hum of success and the buzz of constant activity, found his thoughts unusually loud. The image of Elijah's modest home lingered in his mind, the mismatched furniture, the faded photos on the walls, and the warmth that radiated from every corner. He had left with a sense of gratitude, but also an undeniable tug of responsibility. Elijah's kindness wasn't just a random act, it was a reflection of a family that thrived despite their challenges. Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that he had to do something meaningful in return. As he pulled into his long driveway, the grandeur of his mansion suddenly felt hollow. The sprawling gardens and marble fountains seemed like a stark contrast to the humble, lively home he had just visited. The stillness of his house echoed louder than it ever had before, and for the first time in years, Matthew felt the weight of its emptiness. The next morning, with a renewed sense of purpose, Matthew began making phone calls. He contacted old colleagues, contractors, and suppliers, leveraging his network to bring a plan to life. This wasn't about charity, he told himself. It was about honoring the selflessness Elijah had shown him. By midday, everything was in motion. Trucks and workers were scheduled to arrive at Elijah's home within the week, bringing materials and tools for a complete renovation. When the day finally came, Matthew drove back to Harlan, clipboard in hand, ready to oversee the project. As his car pulled up to the small house, Elijah and his mother stood on the porch, their faces a mix of astonishment and confusion. Workers unloaded supplies, measuring tape in hand, ready to begin the transformation. Elijah's mother was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "You didn't have to do this. We've managed fine on our own." Matthew stepped forward, his tone gentle but firm. "You've done more than manage. You've created something beautiful here. Despite the challenges, you gave me something I didn't know I was missing. Let me give back." Elijah, usually so composed, stood silently beside his mother, his curious eyes darting between the workers and Matthew. After a moment, he asked, "Why are you doing this?" Matthew knelt slightly, meeting the boy's gaze. "Because you showed me what it means to truly help someone, not for recognition or reward, but simply because it's the right thing to do. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Elijah, helping isn't about what we have, it's about showing up." The words seemed to settle over the small family like a warm blanket, their initial hesitation softening into quiet acceptance. Over the next several weeks, the house underwent a remarkable transformation. The sagging porch was replaced with sturdy wood, the roof repaired, and the rusted swing set out back was swapped for a brand new one. Inside, the kitchen received modern appliances. The floors gleamed, and the walls were painted in fresh, vibrant colors. Elijah couldn't resist sneaking out to watch the workers, his eyes lighting up with curiosity as they measured, cut, and built. One of the workers, a burly man named Joe, noticed his interest and began teaching him small tasks. By the end of the first week, Elijah was asking questions about tools and construction, his excitement infectious. From a distance, Matthew watched with a quiet pride. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. As the weeks went by, the transformation of Elijah's home became the talk of the town. Neighbors stopped by, offering smiles, words of encouragement, and even homemade treats for the workers. The once quiet street now buzzed with activity as trucks came and went, carrying lumber, shingles, and paint. Matthew, always present with his clipboard and quiet authority, coordinated every detail, ensuring the project stayed on schedule. Despite his polished demeanor, his smile was no longer the guarded one he had worn for years. It was genuine, reflecting the fulfillment he felt with each passing day. Elijah, too, found himself drawn into the process. Although Matthew insisted that the boy take time to enjoy being a kid, Elijah's curiosity couldn't be contained. Each morning, he would sit on the porch, his eyes following every movement of the crew. One afternoon, Joe, the burly construction worker who had taken a liking to Elijah, waved him over. "Come on, kid," Joe said with a grin, handing him a measuring tape. "Let's see if you've got what it takes to cut these planks right." Elijah hesitated at first, unsure if he could manage the task, but Joe's easy encouragement put him at ease. Before long, Elijah was eagerly measuring and marking wood, his hands steady despite his inexperience. The workers found his enthusiasm contagious, often explaining their tools and techniques to him. Elijah asked questions with wide-eyed wonder, absorbing every detail like a sponge. From the sidelines, Matthew watched the boy's excitement with a quiet pride that surprised even himself. It had been years since he had seen someone so eager to learn, so determined to understand. It reminded him of his younger self, back when he was still full of dreams and unshaken by the weight of ambition. Elijah's energy was a spark that reignited something in Matthew, a sense of purpose that had been buried beneath years of routine and expectation. Inside the house, Elijah's mother, Clara, worked tirelessly to keep the workers fueled with coffee and snacks. She was hesitant at first, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the renovations. But as the days passed, her gratitude grew. "You've done so much for us," she said one evening as she handed Matthew a cup of iced tea. Her voice trembled with emotion. "This house, it's more than just a home now. It's a new beginning." Matthew shook his head, his tone soft. "You and Elijah gave me something I didn't even know I needed. This is the least I can do to thank you." By the end of the third week, the house had undergone a complete transformation. The sagging porch was now a sturdy, welcoming space with freshly painted railings. The kitchen gleamed with modern appliances, and Elijah's bedroom, once bare and utilitarian, now reflected his personality, with bright walls and a desk perfect for tinkering with projects. Out back, the new swing set stood tall and strong, its chains glinting in the sunlight. One evening, as the crew wrapped up for the day, Elijah stood on the porch, looking out at his transformed home. "It's incredible," he murmured, his voice filled with wonder. Matthew, standing beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's what you and your mom deserve," he said. "You've both shown me that real wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in how we treat the people around us." As the final touches were being added to the house, the air around it seemed to hum with anticipation. The workers moved with a sense of pride, knowing they had contributed to something far more meaningful than just a renovation. Neighbors stopped by frequently, marveling at the transformation and offering small gestures of appreciation, like jars of homemade jam or freshly baked pies. The once quiet street had become a hub of warmth and camaraderie, all centered around the house that now stood as a symbol of resilience and kindness. Elijah, still brimming with curiosity, spent most of his days shadowing Joe and the other workers. He had become an unofficial apprentice, asking thoughtful questions and even offering ideas that, to everyone's surprise, were often clever and practical. "You've got a knack for this, kid," Joe told him one afternoon as they worked on installing the new porch railing. Elijah beamed, his confidence growing with every encouraging word. Matthew observed these moments from a short distance, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He saw in Elijah a reflection of his younger self, the same drive to learn, the same hunger for something bigger. But unlike his own journey, which had been dominated by relentless ambition and material success, Elijah's spirit seemed grounded in something purer, a desire to contribute, to be useful, and to make things better for those around him. Inside the house, Clara stood in the newly renovated kitchen, her hands resting on the cool marble countertop as she surveyed the space. It felt almost surreal to her, like stepping into someone else's life. The old, creaking cabinets had been replaced with sturdy ones that gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the window. The appliances, sleek and modern, promised to make her daily routines easier. But more than the physical changes, it was the thoughtfulness behind them that moved her. Every detail seemed to speak of care and respect, a recognition of the life she had worked so hard to build for her family. "Thank you," she said quietly when Matthew joined her. Her voice wavered slightly, and she blinked back tears. "I don't know how to express how much this means to us." Matthew shook his head gently. "You've already said it, Clara. The way you've raised Elijah, the way you've faced everything life's thrown at you with grace, that's more than enough thanks." Outside, Elijah was helping Joe assemble the final piece of the new swing set. The old one, which had been a rickety collection of rusted chains and splintered wood, was now replaced by a sturdy, brightly painted structure. As they tightened the last bolt, Elijah gave it a testing swing, his laughter ringing out like a melody that filled the yard. A group of neighborhood kids gathered around, waiting their turn, their faces lit with excitement. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, the project was officially completed. The family stood together on the porch, marveling at their transformed home. Matthew handed Clara a small envelope, his expression both earnest and a little nervous. "This is for anything you might need in the future," he said. "I want to make sure you and Elijah have everything you need to keep moving forward." Clara hesitated, her pride wrestling with her gratitude. But Matthew held up a hand. "It's not about charity," he said softly. "It's about honoring the kindness you and Elijah have shown me. This is my way of saying thank you." Elijah, standing beside his mother, looked up at Matthew with a wide grin. "You've done so much for us, Mr. Matthew," he said. "I hope I can do the same for others someday." Matthew placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You already are, Elijah. Never underestimate the power of a small act of kindness. It can change lives." The days following the renovation were filled with a sense of new beginnings. The house, once a symbol of endurance, now radiated warmth and hope. Neighbors stopped by daily, not just to admire the changes, but to share stories and laughter. Elijah had become something of a local celebrity, his selflessness the talk of the town. Children played on the newly installed swing set, their laughter echoing through the yard, while Clara welcomed guests with freshly brewed coffee and warm smiles. Matthew found himself visiting more often than he anticipated. Each visit felt less like a charitable gesture and more like reconnecting with an extended family. He often sat on the porch, sipping iced tea as he watched Elijah interact with his friends and the workers who had become his mentors. The boy's boundless curiosity and genuine enthusiasm for learning filled Matthew with a sense of pride and hope for the future. One afternoon, Elijah approached Matthew with a notebook clutched tightly in his hands. His face was lit with excitement, though there was a hint of nervousness in his eyes. "Mr. Matthew," he began, his voice steady but eager, "I've been writing down everything Joe and the others taught me. Measurements, tools, techniques, all of it. I want to make sure I remember it." Matthew took the notebook and flipped through its pages, his heart swelling as he saw the meticulous notes and sketches. "This is impressive, Elijah," he said sincerely. "You've got the drive and focus of someone far beyond your years." Elijah beamed at the praise. "Do you think I could be an engineer someday?" he asked, his voice tinged with both hope and uncertainty. Matthew placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder, meeting his gaze with unwavering confidence. "Not only do I think you can, Elijah, I know you will. You've got the determination, the intelligence, and most importantly, the heart. Never doubt that." Encouraged by Matthew's words, Elijah began spending even more time with Joe and the crew, soaking up their knowledge like a sponge. Joe, recognizing the boy's potential, started giving him more challenging tasks. From reading blueprints to calculating materials, Elijah's face would light up each time he successfully completed a new challenge, and his growing confidence was infectious. Meanwhile, Clara watched her son with a mixture of pride and gratitude. Seeing Elijah's passion flourish reminded her of the values she had worked so hard to instill in him: resilience, kindness, and a love for learning. She often caught herself marveling at how far they had come, thanks to Matthew's generosity and Elijah's indomitable spirit. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the yard, Matthew stood with Clara near the porch. The laughter of children playing in the distance created a soothing backdrop. "You've given him something priceless," Clara said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "More than just a better home. You've given him a future." Matthew smiled, his eyes reflecting the same warmth as hers. "I think he's given me something too," he replied, "a reminder of what it means to truly live. It's not about the money or the success, it's about connection, purpose, and the impact we leave behind." As the stars began to pepper the night sky, Elijah joined them on the porch, his notebook in hand and a look of quiet determination on his face. Sitting between Clara and Matthew, he opened the book and began explaining his latest idea for a project, a bridge he wanted to design for the creek behind their house. The way his eyes sparkled as he spoke, his dreams spilling out into the evening air, left both adults in silent awe. As the renovations came to a close, the house was no longer just a place to live. It had transformed into a sanctuary of hope and possibility. The once creaky porch now stood sturdy and proud, its fresh wood gleaming in the sunlight. Inside, vibrant colors adorned the walls, and the scent of new beginnings filled the air. Neighbors who had watched the transformation from afar began to visit more frequently, their faces lighting up as they marveled at the changes. Elijah couldn't hide his excitement. Every corner of the house seemed to invite exploration, from the renovated kitchen with its modern appliances to the backyard swing set that now stood strong and inviting. He darted from room to room, pointing out every detail to his friends, his voice brimming with pride and gratitude. For the first time, he felt like his family had a home that matched the strength and resilience they had always carried in their hearts. Matthew found himself spending more time in Harlan than he had ever anticipated. Each visit felt like stepping into a world he hadn't realized he missed, a world filled with laughter, genuine conversations, and a sense of belonging. Clara's kitchen became a place of comfort for him, where the smell of fresh bread and hearty meals always greeted him warmly. She often thanked him for his generosity, but Matthew would shake his head, insisting that the gratitude was mutual. "You and Elijah have given me more than I could ever repay," he'd say sincerely. Elijah's curiosity about construction continued to grow. The crew members, now more like mentors, encouraged his enthusiasm. Joe, the burly carpenter with a soft heart, often took Elijah under his wing, teaching him how to measure precisely and handle tools safely. Elijah soaked up the lessons, his determination shining brighter with each passing day. "You've got a real knack for this, kid," Joe said one afternoon, handing Elijah a measuring tape. "Don't let go of that spark." One evening, as the sun cast a golden glow over the neighborhood, Matthew gathered with Clara and Elijah on the porch. The air was filled with the faint hum of cicadas and the occasional laughter of children playing nearby. Matthew leaned back in his chair, gazing at the yard that had once been a patchwork of struggle but now radiated life and joy. "Elijah," Matthew said, his voice steady yet warm, "I've been thinking, what if we took your interest in construction a step further? I know some people in the field who could help you learn even more, shadowing them, seeing what it's like to work on larger projects." Elijah's eyes widened with excitement. "Really? You think I could do that?" "Absolutely," Matthew replied, his tone filled with conviction. "You've got the drive and the heart for it. I'd be honored to help you explore it." Clara watched her son's face light up, her heart swelling with pride. "You're giving him opportunities one never dreamed possible," she said softly to Matthew. "I'm just following his lead," Matthew replied with a smile. "He's the one showing us what's possible." As the evening deepened, the trio sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky shift from amber to deep blue. For Matthew, this was a far cry from the life he had once known. It wasn't the wealth or success that brought fulfillment. It was the connections, the small moments of shared humanity, and the chance to witness a young boy's dreams begin to take shape. As the final touches were completed on Elijah's home, the small yard brimmed with life. Neighbors gathered to marvel at the transformation, their admiration reflected in warm smiles and kind gestures. Freshly baked pies, jars of homemade jam, and bouquets of wildflowers were left on the porch as tokens of goodwill. Elijah raced around, his laughter echoing through the air as he proudly showed his friends the new swing set and freshly painted walls. The house, once a quiet testament to perseverance, now stood as a beacon of hope and renewed possibilities. Matthew sat quietly on the sturdy new porch railing, sipping a glass of iced tea Clara had handed him. The evening sunlight cast a warm glow over the house, highlighting every detail of the work that had been done. Clara joined him, her face alight with a mix of joy and gratitude. "This isn't just a house anymore," she said softly, her voice breaking slightly. "It's a home, a real home, and it's all because of you." Matthew shook his head gently. "It's because of Elijah," he corrected. "He's the one who reminded me of what matters. You've raised an incredible boy." Nearby, Elijah approached them, his energy still boundless despite the long day. He glanced between Matthew and his mother, his face thoughtful. "Mr. Matthew," he began, his voice steady yet tinged with emotion, "I've been thinking. I want to do what you did for us. I want to help people, too." Matthew's heart swelled as he reached out to place a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You already have, Elijah," he said sincerely. "Your kindness started all of this. Don't ever lose that spark." As the sun dipped lower, the family and Matthew sat together, watching the sky shift from gold to amber, then deep indigo. For Matthew, this moment felt like the culmination of a journey he hadn't realized he was on, a journey back to the simplicity of connection, the warmth of gratitude, and the joy of giving. When it was time for Matthew to leave, Clara and Elijah walked him to his car. The boy's grin was wide, and Clara's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "This isn't goodbye," Matthew said, his voice steady but warm. "I'll be back." In the weeks that followed, Elijah's curiosity blossomed into a full-fledged passion. Matthew arranged for him to shadow professionals in construction and engineering, providing him with opportunities to explore a future he hadn't dared to dream of before. Each visit to Harlan brought Matthew closer to the family, and he found himself drawn not just to the town, but to the sense of purpose it had rekindled in him. As the story came full circle, Matthew realized that the most valuable lesson he had learned wasn't about wealth or success. It was about the quiet power of kindness, the strength of resilience, and the beauty of paying it forward. Elijah's simple act of helping a stranger had set off a ripple effect, transforming not just his own life, but Matthew's as well.